My guest today is Dr. Einat Wilf, a leading thinker on Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. She was a member of the Knesset with the Labour Party and then the Independence Party from 2010 to 2013, and is the author of 7 books. Following the horrific Hamas terrorist attacks on the 7th of October, Einat has become one of the leading voices on the issue. Einat, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm okay.
Good, good. I sort of have to ask start by asking about Zionism. Anti-Semites constantly like to claim that Zionism has no connection to Judaism or Jewish identity. Firstly, for you, what is the definition of Zionism, and then what would you say to those people who claim it has nothing to do with Judaism?
Certainly. Zionism is the political movement for self determination, liberation of the Jewish people in their ancient homeland. Again, Zionism is the political movement for self determination and liberation of the Jewish people in their ancient homeland. Each parts of this definition are important to understand. So, Zionism is a political movement. That's important because sometimes people say Zionism is a 3,000-year-old movement, which it's not. The connection between the Jewish people in Judea, between the people of Israel and the land of Israel, between the Jewish people and Zion, is indeed millennia old. But Zionism, as a practical plan to implement the idea of the restoration of the Jewish people in their ancient homeland, really takes off in the 19th century. So, first of all, it's a political movement with a clear goal of achieving self determination. The second element is really self determination and liberation. That is a universal ideal that really takes off in the 19th century. This is when Zionism is born as part of the general birth of nations as empires begin to collapse, to weaken. Peoples, meaning people who share a coherent sense of language, history, sometimes background, religion, ethnicity, they have a sense of being a nation and they want to govern themselves by themselves, free from imperial control. So that is the idea of self-determination, liberation mostly from imperial control of the Jewish people. This is important. Self-determination is of peoples, of nations. Zionism makes the claim, first and foremost, that the Jews are a people. The idea that Judaism is a religion, and religion primarily and only, is actually a 19th century Western construct intended to fit Jews into the secularized nations. The idea that they are citizens, that their nation is France, and they are individually, privately Jews by religion. But what Zionism claims is that Jews are first and foremost a people and a nation, that is their most foundational and broadest identity. So again, it's important to emphasize the Jews as a people. And finally, where is all of this going to happen? The liberation, the self-determination of the people? Well, in the land of Israel, in Zion, hence the name Zionism. And in that sense, there is only one land to which the Jewish people as a people are connected. The Jewish people have been dispersed. They have lived in many places around the world, but there is only one land, one country to which they are connected in terms of their identity as a people. And everything Jewish is through and through connected to the land of Israel. The Hebrew calendar, the Jewish calendar by which we celebrate Jewish holidays, is an agricultural calendar of the climate of the land of Israel. And yet it was preserved in Poland, where it doesn't make sense in terms of the weather, but it was preserved there because the Jews lived according to the calendar of the land to which they knew one day they would be restored. Every Jewish holiday is connected to the language, to the land, to the climate, to the history. So Zionism, again, is a political movement, but it is deeply based on the idea that the Jewish people are a people, that they have a connection to only one land as a people, the land of Israel, Zion. So you can't have Zionism without a connection to the history of the Jewish people, to their rituals, to their calendar, to who they are, to their identity. Now, it is true that Jews have opposed from the beginning Zionism as a political program. They thought there are better political programs: communism, socialism, Bundism, being French, being German, assimilating. All of these were various different political programs for how to be Jewish in the modern era. The problem with all those other ideas, which were very attractive, many Jews were communists and Bundists and socialists and assimilated into France and Germany. But the verdict of history to all these alternative political ideas was ultimately very cruel. It's not that they were badly argued or that these ideas lost in the marketplace of ideas. They lost because the verdict of history was cruel. And as a result, especially after World War II and the birth of the State of Israel, most Jews have become Zionists. So to try to claim that Zionism has nothing to do with being Jewish, the Jewish people, really requires one to contort into such intellectual knots that it really becomes absurd and I would say pathetic at one point.
Mm. And what you've just said echoes our own polling. We recently did polling of British Jews where we found 80% identify as Zionists. Only 6% said that they do not identify as Zionists. So what you say echoes in the polling. Now, since the 7th of October, as you well know, there have been global anti-Israel demonstrations. And at these, we have seen appalling levels of anti-Semitic rhetoric, with banners and intimidation of Jews, glorification of terrorism, and even violence. Here at CAA, we have regularly gone into these demonstrations. We have interviewed the participants of the London marches. And one question we ask quite a lot is we say, what is Zionism? What does Zionism mean to you? And pretty much every time we hear them say, well, Zionism is racism, Zionism is Nazism, sometimes Zionism is white supremacy. Now, you have, I believe, referred to this as the Placard Strategy. Can you tell us your thoughts about this? What does this mean? And how has the word Zionism become hijacked in this way?
So, the placard strategy is the ingenious process, which you see on placards, but it's much bigger than that, where Israel, Zionism, and sometimes just the Star of David on the placards is equated. So, the way these placards are drawn is you write Israel or Zionism, or you draw Star of David, then you put the equation sign. And then on the other side of that equation, you put a litany of words. And the placard strategy has been so successful that everyone knows what those words are: racism, colonialism, apartheid, and then it escalates into Nazism, genocide. If you're in America, it will be white supremacy. Now, those words are put forward by those who use them to claim that they are used because they reflect reality. The reason that they're actually chosen is because they are universally understood to connote evil. So, the reason that the placard strategy is both ingenious and dangerous is that it creates almost a nursery rhyme effect of a refrain in people's minds: Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. Now, if you begin to let people know that there is an evil out there, then you prepare their minds for the fact that any means necessary will be justified to eradicate that evil. You create a global mindset by which, when October 7th happens, the response in many circles whose mind has been prepared in this way is they had it coming because there was evil. This was evil. And then we saw in many demonstrations after October 7th the placard that said, "Keep the world clean." And with the Star of David in a trash bin. That placard is actually the logical conclusion of the placard strategy. Because if you argue that there is an evil out there, then you want the world to be without that evil, the world to be kept clean from that Star of David. And here you're actually tapping into one of the most ancient and dangerous ideas, that between this world and utopia stands the collective Jew. And that is one of the most ancient and most dangerous ideas. And it's not a coincidence that all the evil words are placed on the side of Zionism, and all the good words are placed on the side of anti Zionism, which is masked behind Palestinianism. What are these words? Justice, freedom, equality, rights. So thereby you create this kind of mental framework of the evil that needs to be eradicated. Now, the placard strategy is not only on placards. You see it everywhere. You see it in media. Give an anti-Israel speaker 30 seconds, they will manage to say racism, apartheid, genocide, regardless of what you ask them. The placard strategy, another ingenious part of it is that it gets laundered through international bodies. So Zionism as racism was brought by the Soviet Union and the Muslim world to the United Nations in 1975. Why was Zionism equal racism brought to the UN in 75? Did something happen? Actually, nothing happened except that a few months earlier, the United Nations resolved that racism is bad. The nations united to fight against racism. They passed a resolution to fight racism. So now that the UN said that racism is universally acknowledged as evil, then immediately the Soviet Union and the Arab world moved forward to equate Zionism with racism, because now we know that racism is evil. And the Soviet Union really does not get enough credit, together with Tsarist Russia, for their contribution to globalizing Jew hate. What the Soviet Union did is take anti-Semitism, which was no longer legitimate with the fall of Tsarist Russia, and especially after World War II, and give it the respectable mask of anti-Zionism. And the respectability is laundered through international bodies. Taking the idea of genocide to the International Court of Justice is a page out of the Soviet playbook of laundering the placard strategy. So they created this idea of laundering it. They initiated the placard strategy, and then they created the idea of making it respectable by laundering it through international bodies, by creating academic degrees. For years, you could get in the Soviet Union PhDs in anti-Zionism. The Palestinian leadership got those PhDs for years, and then it was exported to the European left, and from there to the Anglo world, where it flourishes now in American campuses. But it's an ingenious strategy, and it's a very dangerous one.
You just mentioned it being imported to American campuses, and I can't speak to you without mentioning the litany of encampments in America that have actually since made their way over here to the UK. We have heard countless reports of Jewish students being intimidated by these anti-Israel activists on these encampments at universities across the Western world. Can you tell us what you think is going on here and the dynamics behind it, as opposed to when it first came over here, when that ideology first came over here?
So again, we need to understand that this was decades in the making. A lot of the people who are doing it right now want us to believe that they are responding to what's happening right now. But once you know the history, once you look at how the placard strategy was created by the Soviet Union, how it was carefully exported, built, laundered through international bodies, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And you understand that whatever is being said on various campuses today, there's nothing new. The amazing thing is that no one is saying anything new. They are echoing very, very old ideas that they themselves were also renovated masks for even more ancient ideas. Why is it happening right now? Here we need to understand the dynamics of anti Semitism, anti Zionism, anti Jewish obsessions historically. Even though you could argue that a certain obsession with the collective Jew, a certain scapegoating of the collective Jew, is a mark of Western and Islamic civilization because of their history in emerging and then claiming to replace Jewish civilization, there's a question why it ebbs and flows. Because even if it's a permanent fixture, it's not always at its height. So the question is, what triggers it to go above a certain latent level? And here the answer is always the same. It's not about what the Jews have done, but it's always about a crisis in the society that requires a scapegoat. Um, Rene Girard, who dealt a lot with studying societies in crisis, scapegoating mechanism, talked about how societies in crisis will ask two questions: what to do and who to blame. Ultimately, societies that emphasize what to do emerge from the crisis. Societies that get stuck in scapegoating and who to blame just kind of wallow in the crisis and collapse. Now, when you look at scapegoating, there's all kinds of scapegoats. One of the most reliable scapegoats is the Jewish scapegoat because it already has millennia of cultural capital invested in it. You only need to say dead children or the blood of children in order to tap into the idea that Jews kill non Jewish children ritually, that there's a certain bloodlust. I talked about tapping into the ancient idea that what separates this world from utopia is the collective Jew. So there's a lot of ancient ideas that you only need to say a few words and you tap into that vast cultural capital. So the question is not what is wrong with the Jews. That's a question the Jews ask all the time. We ask, we answer. We're never absent self criticism. That's never something we lack. But when you see a society that becomes a non Jewish society that becomes obsessed with the collective Jew, the correct question to ask is what is wrong with the society? What is the crisis being experienced? And it's not a coincidence that we're seeing the rise of anti Zionism in academia together with the exposure of the rot in academia. We're seeing an academia that is not producing much of value, that is more indoctrinating rather than researching, where it's more about activism rather than research and study and seeking truth. So the fact that we have an organization, a system, the academic system, for example, in crisis, that it's not a coincidence that the rise of anti-Zionism, the scapegoating mechanism, comes together with the crisis in that society.
On campuses, it seems like anti-Israel activists rely on silencing tactics, for example, by threatening or intimidating Jewish or Israeli guest speakers and their audiences. But yet it seems that these same people claim to be very concerned with free speech when they say things that fall foul of the IRA definition, the international definition of anti-Semitism. And for those interested, we have a very good resource on our website about how the definition interacts with freedom of expression in English and European law. But in that, I have to ask, how does one make sense of this paradox of shutting down speech they don't like and talking about free speech to protect their right to be racist?
Well, you will see it actually in almost every element of international law or any general rule that when it comes to the Jews, you suddenly distort it and make exceptions. Uh, that is far from being the only instance. The idea of occupation had to be redefined in order to claim insanely that Gaza was still occupied by Israel after it left completely. The very definition of genocide had to be completely like emptied of every notion in order to be able to apply it to Israel. I, again, sometimes half joke that it's not a coincidence that Kafka was Jewish. Um, so every word that has a general meaning, I wrote a whole book on how the word refugee has a certain meaning for everyone in the world. But then when it comes to Palestinians and being against the Jewish state, the entire world is stripped of any international standard and meaning and made to mean something completely different. So the fact that, again, Jews are being exempted from free speech is merely part of a long list of how international rules are not internationally applied when it comes to Jews.
These students on these encampments, do you feel that they pretty much know what they're doing and they are doing so willingly and all that stuff? Or do you think it's possible that there are students who are being manipulated or socially pressured into participating in the encampments? Because essentially, right now, it is viewed as cool or right to hate Israel.
So there's no doubt that there's a massive amount of social pressure and trendiness and bullying, both pull and push tactics. But I actually don't care about the motivations. I care about the outcome, what they're participating in, because a lot of people will look at their own personal motivations and will be appalled that they are blamed for endangering Jewish life or anything of the sort, because they, in their world, they're fighting for good. And remember, once you have established that Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil, then you do create the mindset that anyone fighting it is thereby, by definition, good and righteous, because there's no greater good in this world than the eradication of evil, by definition. What I care is the opposite. What happens, regardless of what are the personal motivations, because you can have the best motivations and yet participate in something that will have a very terrible outcome. I participated for a few years in some high profile debates on whether anti Zionism is indeed the new anti Semitism. And I lost those debates because, again, you bring a few Jews. They claim that, like we began our conversation, this has nothing to do with being Jewish. And kind of, if you make a blanket statement, it all falls. So I remember coming from those debates and thinking, especially when I noticed the reaction of the crowd, which had, as they say, pogrom evening energy. Um, I, um, I said, okay, this is not a theoretical debate. We're not debating this or that tax, and you were the better debater. I realize this is an urgent practical question. And the question is the following: what happens to Jews, real life Jews, when anti Zionism begins to be the dominant ideology in any society? And I looked for the last century when anti Zionism emerged as the respectable replacement for the discredited anti Semitism. And I realized that the historical record is clear. Everywhere that anti Zionism was allowed to reign unimpeded and it became the dominant ideology, ultimately no Jews are left. And you can look one by one. You can look at the Arab world in the 40s and 50s, where from Morocco to Afghanistan, within the 2 decades where anti Zionism was at its height as defining what it means to be an Arab, no Jews were left. And throughout those 2 decades, the Arabs claimed that they love Jews. They have nothing against Jews. It's only about Zionists. And yet no Jews were left at the end of it. The Soviet Union, again, the Soviet Union was at the forefront of creating, developing, making anti Zionism the respectable replacement. And we know how it treated its Jews. And the Soviet Union claimed to not even recognize that the Jews are a separate nation or religion, merely a different ethnicity. We know more recently Venezuela, Poland had an outbreak of anti Zionism in 1968, after which the few remaining Jews in Poland were all gone, removed from academic positions. In parentheses, Anti-Semitism in Germany, anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union, in the Arab world, were all very useful to removing Jews from academic positions, from positions of prominence. So people found it very useful. The Iranian regime, the current kind of supporter of anti-Zionism, hiding behind the mask of Palestinianism, we know a Jewish community of 150,000 was reduced to barely 8,000. Uh, in your country, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, uh, and he's the classic. I'm an anti-Zionist, not an anti-Semite. I have no problem with Jews, and yet within weeks of him taking over the Labour Party, it became a cesspool of anti Jewish obsession. Jews felt that they had to leave, and Jews in Britain understood that if he were to become prime minister, their entire life in Britain is in question. And we're seeing it now on American campuses. If you take an American campus as a distinct social unit, when anti Zionism begins to be the ideology of the campus, it becomes hostile to Jewish life. And if this will not be fought against, there will be no Jews left. So, my argument is this: I don't care what your motivations are. I don't care what the students are thinking or what their personal motivations are. They ignorant? Are they malicious? Are they just being trendy? What I care about is what they're participating in, wittingly or unwittingly, is in a process that always ended one way, which is with no Jews being left.
You actually have a new 5-part series, which I want to talk to you about. New 5-part series: Zionism and Anti-Zionism, the history of two opposing ideas. How did this come about? And by the way, where can people watch it or listen to it?
So, a couple years ago, I was a visiting professor at Georgetown University. I gave a course on Zionism and anti-Zionism, the history of the two ideas, beginning from the mid 19th century, going back in history where Zionism comes from, but really looking at the history of the ideas beginning in the 19th century, initially the intra-Jewish debate, and ultimately the broader attitude both of the West and the Arab and Muslim world to Zionism. Um, One of my students, Zoe Tara Zeigerman, when she ended the course, she told me that this course was more valuable to her than dozens of hours of therapy, indicating that basically anti-Zionism takes an emotional toll. It has this dynamic of bullying. And she said, everybody needs to hear this course. Because one of the things about this course is that rather than talking about Zionism, about anti Zionism, the students engage directly with the text of Zionists and anti Zionists, and thereby became educated about it more than almost anyone who talks about it today. So what Zoe beautifully did, together with Tikva, you can find it in Tikva, but you can just look Einat Wilf course on Zionism and anti-Zionism. You will find it. It's free. Those are 5 episodes, 40 minutes each. There's also a study guide if you want to read the text yourself. But I can say that if you spend the 5 episodes of 40 minutes, by the end of it, you will be much more educated than many of the people who claim to know what Zionism and anti-Zionism is, and you will understand how nothing that is being said today is new.
Yeah, I think a lot of people could benefit from watching that. Now, we have not so long ago marked Yom HaShoah, the Israel's National Holocaust Remembrance Day. Um, since the 7th of October, Holocaust memorials and museums around the world have been vandalized, blockaded, covered up, or otherwise targeted in some way. On Yom HaShoah, anti-Israel activists actually picketed outside Auschwitz concentration camp when people were partaking in March of the Living. They were also wearing the yellow stars that were forced upon Jews during the Holocaust. What do you think this says? Why is this happening? That people are actually demonstrating outside Holocaust museums and concentration camps?
So first of all, this really is something that has been decades in the making. We've seen, I remember when the International Holocaust Remembrance Day was declared, and I really noticed year by year the process by which it became what I came to call some bad people did some bad things to other people day. It became universalized to the point of like just making generalized statements, not mentioning Jews, or if you mention Jews, it was just part of a long list of people. And there's no question that this remains uh, the one thing that so many in the West want to simply go away. And one of the ways that they wanted to go away is by one of them is this kind of total watering down and universalizing it. But another one is the Holocaust inversion. The Jews are actually the new Nazis. And if you look at a lot of the arguments on Zionism, one of the key elements they do is the reversal of cause and effect. So, for example, you saw a lot of people saying, look at how Israel has responded to October 7th. That makes you understand why October 7th was justified. So you reverse the cause and effect, you reverse the timeline. And this is something that's done a lot. Once you notice it is a repeating theme. So the idea is, how do we retroactively justify the Holocaust and finally get rid of that stain on Western civilization, on the Palestinians who are hugely supportive, their leadership, which was part of the Nazi leadership? How do you erase that stain? You retroactively turn the Jews into Nazis, and then let's go back to the Placard Strategy. They are evil, and the eradication of evil is thereby justified. So, this notion of inversion, erasure, watering down is something that comes from the deepest recesses of Western and Islamic civilization to try to erase what they've done by ultimately creating an ex post facto justification. You see, they deserved it. And that's what we're seeing, and it's being acted out on various places, museums, memorials. Uh, it's a bit like the Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, right? Out, out, out. They want to get rid of the damn stain and they just can't.
And I want to ask you about the role of UNRWA, which is something that you've spoken about in the role of the 7th of October attacks, UNRWA being the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. It's a part of the United Nations. You have co-authored a whole book about the issue of UNRWA. For those who don't know, what does UNRWA claim to be, and what is it in actuality? And what role does it play in perpetuating anti Semitic beliefs in schools and Arab culture?
So, UNRWA claims to be a social services humanitarian agency that merely supplies Palestinian refugees until there is a resolution, a political resolution of the conflict. In actuality, none of this is true. UNRWA, despite the letters UN, is actually a purely Palestinian organization. When you hear about UNRWA employees, UN employees, people stealing, they're all Palestinians. I had a journalist yesterday ask me, what do you have to say about the recent revelations of UNRWA employees stealing aid and selling it? And I'm like, once you understand that these are not UN employees coming from the outside. These are not Danes and Norwegians that came to Gaza to help. These are Gazans, these are Palestinians, born and bred Gazans and Palestinians who partake in the Gazan and Palestinian vision of from the river to the sea. They use UNRWA to perpetuate it. Then all the questions disappear. So UNRWA is actually, except for a very thin layer at the top, which asks money from donor nations, is a purely Palestinian organization. It is devoted to the Palestinian vision of from the river to the sea and the idea of return. And just so we understand what return is in the Palestinian mindset, people think that return is some kind of nostalgia for a long lost home of a great grandparent when Palestinians were displaced by war, in parentheses, a completely unnecessary war that they waged for the declared purpose of no Jewish state. There could have been an Arab state living to a Jewish state, but they preferred that there be no Jewish state. Um, but the idea of return is October 7th. October 7th is the minute by minute realization of the Palestinian vision of return, which, if you go back to texts in the 50s and 60s, always had the element of brutal triumph over the Jewish state. We will tear their hearts out, their fingernails. This is why you saw so much exhilaration on October 7th, because for 75 years, Palestinians have been groomed and have been grooming themselves, because the teachers are Palestinians, for that day of return, for that brutal, violent triumph over the Jewish state. That's why there was so much exhilaration, because that's what they've been waiting for. They're not waiting for political resolution. They're waiting for the Jewish state not to exist. That's the only resolution that they're willing to consider. That's why they remain the only group in the world that, from a war that was in the 40s, continued to claim to be refugees, even though, back to what we discussed, by any international standard, 95% of those that UNRWA claims are refugees, they're not. And even among the 5%, 300,000 that would be refugees by international standards, none of them would be refugees today if they were treated according to the international standard of settling refugees in place or in new countries, rather than waiting for the undoing of history and the undoing of another state. So UNRWA is, unfortunately and tragically, the mechanism by which United Nations legitimacy, those letters still carry a lot of power, and Western money and legitimacy is funneled to continue to sustain, fuel, and feed the Palestinian vision of no Jewish state, known as from the river to the sea or return.
Einat, I have to ask you, what is concerning you the most right now about the Jewish future?
So I look at history for the last century and I say, let's look at who the supporters of the Palestinian cause were. And because the Arabs of the Mandate, now known as Palestinians, because their cause, beginning in the 1920s, was singularly focused on the prevention of a Jewish state rather than a positive cause of building their state, they found that by the fact that they were waging a total war against the Jewish state, or the Jewish state in process, and it's important, they were not fighting any Jews. They were fighting the Jews that dared challenge the Jewish condition. The fact that Jews were persecuted, of lower status in Arab and Muslim lands, that their fate was at the mercy of others. The fact that the Arabs of the Mandate were waging a total war against Jews who dared stand up for themselves meant that they could always rely on substantial support by any power that was the most anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist of the moment. So in the 30s and 40s, the Arabs of the Mandate have a very fruitful collaboration with the Nazis. This is not some side issue. Today, people try to pretend that the Mufti and Hitler just had lunch. The Mufti, the leader of the Arabs of the Mandate, was part of the Nazi system. He escaped trial in Nuremberg through a side deal. The insertion of Nazi propaganda through Arabic speaking radio plagues us to this day. We see it in the Hamas language and charter. And so the Nazis were the main supporters of the Palestinian total war against the Jewish state. And then the Nazis were defeated and sent to the dustbin of history, and they were replaced by the Pan-Arabists, who turned Palestinianism into a secular theology. The idea that to be Arab was to be anti-Zionist, supporting Palestinianism. And then the Pan-Arabists were defeated and mostly headed to the dustbin of history. And the Soviet Union came into the void, really taking anti-Zionism global through the Placard Strategy behind the mask of Palestinianism. That's why Zionism as racism actually created an entire structure that persists to this day in the United Nations of so-called supporting Palestinian rights. But it was really just a Soviet way of taking anti-Zionism global, laundering it through international bodies under the mask of Palestinianism. And then the Soviet Union is defeated and heads to the dustbin of history. And it is replaced by Iran and increasingly by what we're saying the Western militant progressives, Western communists, Marxists, calling what you will. Now, on the plus side, I have no doubt that the Ayatollah regime and the supporters of Palestinianism and anti-Zionism in the West will meet the same fate as their predecessors. The Pan-Arabists, the Soviets, they will be in the dustbin of history. I have no doubt of that. The only question is, how much damage will they cause to the Jews and to the world at large in the process? Because the Nazis, the Pan-Arabists, the Soviets, the Iranians, the mullahs, on their way to the dustbin of history, they caused a lot of damage to the Jews. And they caused a lot of mayhem globally. So my concern right now is, where are we at this moment? I think this is a moment of peril for the Jewish people, certainly, for the world at large, high probability. And my question right now is, how do we ensure as little harm to the Jewish people? I care about our people first and foremost, but certainly for the world. But until this is resolved, until the Ayatollah regime finds itself in the dustbin of history, how do we ensure that it does minimal harm to the Jewish people and ultimately to the world at large?
Mm. And I want to ask you a question now that I ask all of our guests, which is, if someone who is not Jewish comes to you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
So I think, first of all, knowing why they're fighting, what they're fighting would be great, because anyone who is not Jewish who tries to stand with Jews is subject to constant assault and attacks. And the more they can steel themselves with knowledge, I had quite a few non-Jews who came to me and said, "Look, I've been standing up for Israel, but they tell me this, they tell me this, they tell me that, and they need to know things." So that's number one. And number two, I think it's important for them to know that this is really a moment where we're going to see whether America, whether Britain are truly exceptional. Because someone asked me a while ago, when I kind of looked at the history of anti-Zionism, they said, "Okay, you're telling us that it always ends with no Jews being left. Do you have a case where people fought back and anti-Zionism was kind of thrown back to the margins and the danger was over?" So for a while, I said, look, my best example is indeed Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. The Jews of Britain, as I'm sure you know, were not known for being very out there. The way of being British Jew was always, we're not like those garish American Jews. We're like more quiet. But they understood that this was a moment of peril, and they came forward and they fought politically, and they made sure that Jeremy Corbyn will not be Prime Minister of Britain. So I used it as a very positive example. But recently, some British Jews told me, you can't pocket that win just yet. We don't feel that we're out of the woods just yet. So the question is Britain and the US, are they going to have a different trajectory? Will they be able to stop this? The thing that gives me a source of hope is both Britain and the US have a history of philo-Semitism. You know, from George Eliot to George Washington, there is a strong strain in both these societies, a bit also in France. We forget that during the Dreyfus affair, France was divided. You know, they are people that fought on the side of for Dreyfus and his innocence. So, in countries that have a history of at least being split, of having philo-Semitism, of having enough people stand up for Jews, that is what gives me a sign of hope. But in many ways, this will not just be about standing up for Jews. This will be standing up for Britain, for America. Because again, every society that allowed anti Zionism to become its reigning dominant ideology ultimately had no Jews left. And I can say it wasn't the better for it. The Arab world could have done nothing stupider than throw out some of its most productive, loyal, creative members. And yet they did that. And in the process, strengthened Israel because many of the Jews that the Arab world ethnically cleansed came to Israel and became some of its best, most creative, loyal citizens. The Soviet Union. How was the Soviet Union served by its persecution of Jews who studied Hebrew or tried to maintain a connection with Israel? How has Iran been served by, throwing out the Jews? LA has been mightily served by having those Iranian Jews, but not Iran. So, and I can assure you that Columbia and Harvard will also not benefit from creating a hostile environment for Jewish life, and neither will the Democratic Party. So, yes, countries, people, societies, they do stupid things. That's why I can't find solace in the idea that, oh, it's such a moronic, counter useful thing to do that they're not going to do it. We know that societies and countries shoot themselves in the foot, especially when it comes to their obsession with the collective Jew. So, people who are standing up against anti Zionism, especially in the UK and Britain and Europe, I think they need to understand that they're standing up for the chance for their societies to beat against the grain of something that has never ended well, not for Jews and not for the societies where Jews lived.
Einat, as we begin to wind down, please tell the listeners, what have you got going on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you?
So I am most active on Twitter. Sometimes I post on Instagram and LinkedIn. Um, any podcasts, lectures that are open, I post there. Any thoughts I have, essays. So, for example, on Yom HaShoah, I posted an essay from 12 years ago that really spoke about this Zionism and denial, this inversion of the Holocaust. I have my books, The War of Return, We Should All Be Zionists. So I'm constantly writing and speaking on those issues. And that's where people can find me, and people can always reach out. Oh, and of course, the Zionism and Anti-Zionism course on Tikva. And I'm available on email. People write to me. To the best of my ability, I answer questions. I'm here as a resource.
All right. Einat Wilf, thank you very much for coming on Podcast Against Anti-Semitism.
Thank you.